The North Fork of the Clearwater River, northern Idaho, the second week of May, 1938. Mid-morning, the water high and brown with snowmelt. A man on the jam crew, 6 seasons on this river, which on this river is enough to be trusted and not enough to be old, stands on a gravel bar and looks upstream at something that has stopped moving. White pine saw logs packed solid across the channel from bank to bank, stacked over one another at broken angles, running back around the bend and out of sight. Behind that mass is the entire winter's cut. 5 months of felling and hauling and decking timber on the riverbank, and the only reason any of it is going anywhere is that the river is high right now and will not stay high. He is not looking at the size of it. Size is not the problem. He is looking at the downstream face, at the 2 or 3 places where the water is being forced through hardest. Because somewhere in there, usually near the front, a small number of logs are carrying the load of everything behind them. Move those, and the river does the rest. The crew will not step out onto it until he says so, and they will not step out at all if he decides it cannot be read. That decision, go or don't go, is made from the bank, before anyone's boots touch floating timber. So what was he actually reading? To read a jam, you have to know what one is. And a jam is not a pile. It is a structure, and it fails the way structures fail. The system that produced it was simple and seasonal. Crews felled timber through the winter and decked it in long piles on the riverbank. When the spring runoff came up, the decks were broken into the water, and the whole winter's work moved downstream at the speed of the river, the cheapest transport available in country, with no roads worth the name. A jam started small, one log grounded on a ledge or a boulder or caught on the inside of a bend. The current kept delivering wood. The stopped logs took the arriving logs and held them, and within minutes the mass became a partial dam, which raised the water behind it, which increased the pressure on it, which locked it tighter. Timber could back up for miles. Documented Wisconsin jams of the 19th century ran a mile on the Wolf River, and one on the Chippewa in 1869 was recorded at 15. Clearing them took days or weeks, and wood shoved into the shallows was often wood the company never got back. So the load went somewhere. It always went somewhere. The question was where, and how a man learned to see it. Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you've been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of American logging between 1900 and 1980, what the falling crew, the rigging crew, the steam donkey, the logging railroad, or the river drive actually required, what the men running them had to know, and what the wood they cut actually became once it reached the mill. Not folklore about giant lumberjacks. The documented technical reality of a dangerous trade practiced by skilled men under real physical risk. What a jam crew's judgment gave a drive that strength alone could not. The ability to tell, before anyone stepped out onto a mile of stacked timber, which log was carrying the load, and roughly how much time a man would have once it moved. And if someone in your family worked in the woods in this era, put it in the comments. If a relative of yours drove logs, on the Kennebec, the Penobscot, the Clearwater, the Menominee, do you know which crew he worked? The jam crew at the head of the drive, or the rear crew that came behind, picking stranded wood out of the shallows? Coming up on this channel, the Wanigan, the floating cookhouse that fed a drive 4 times a day and moved downstream with it. Back to the woods. The answer to how a man learned to read a jam is unromantic. He learned it on the same water, in the same places, year after year. River drivers divided by function, and the divisions are documented consistently across regions. The most experienced men worked the jam crew, also called the beat crew, and their job was to be stationed ahead of the drive at the places where logs were known to catch, not anywhere. Specific bends, specific ledges, specific narrows that had jammed in 1931 and 1934 and would jam again. A jam crew man saw the same rock take the same log a dozen springs running. He watched which jams came apart when a particular piece was pulled and which ones did not move at all. That accumulated record is what finding the key log actually meant. Not intuition, not nerve. A working memory of how this river builds a jam at this location, at this water height, applied to the specific mass in front of him. The phrase in the trade was the key log, sometimes 2 or 3 of them, the piece the structure was bearing against. Knowing which log it was, though, was only half of it. The other half was standing on it. What did a man take out there with him, and what did those tools actually give him? 3 things, and none of them made the work safe. The first was the peavey. It was invented in 1858 by Joseph Peavey, a blacksmith at Stillwater, Maine. A hardwood handle with a forged spike fixed in the end, and a hinged hook mounted on a pivot a short way up. The spike set into the log and held. The hook caught the bark at a second point. Between them, a man of ordinary size could turn, roll, or pry a log weighing a great deal more than he did. Earlier hooks without the fixed end spike slipped and swung, and a slipping tool on floating timber threw men into the water. The peavey was in use on American rivers for more than a century, essentially unchanged, which is the clearest evidence that it solved the problem it was built for. The second was the boot. Caulked boots, pronounced cork, carried short, sharp spikes set in the heel and in rows along the sole. They gave grip on wet bark. That is the whole of what they gave, and on a river drive it was a great deal. The third was the boat. The bateau, in Maine built at Old Town, was a shallow, flat-bottomed craft with high flared ends, rowed and poled. Its job was to put a jam crew alongside the timber and, more importantly, to take them off it. Because the second the key log moved, everything changed. When a jam broke, it broke at once. The structure that had been holding thousands of tons released its load into water that had been backing up behind it for hours or days, and the whole mass came downstream together. The documented hazards of that moment are consistent across archives: falling between logs, being crushed between moving timber, and drowning in water still carrying spring snowmelt. The Forest History Society's own photographic record of Clearwater log jams is cataloged in exactly those terms. This was not the dramatic exception to the work. It was the recognized condition of it, and it was why the jam crew was the most experienced crew on the river, and why the boat waited where it did. There was a memorial practice on Maine and New England rivers that says something plain about how common the loss was. When a driver drowned, his boots were hung in a tree on the bank near where it happened. On certain stretches, more than one pair hung at a time. The rest of the season was less dramatic and constant. Men worked soaked through, in cold water, and their wool dried on them because there was no stopping to dry it. All of which raises a reasonable question. Dynamite existed. Why did anyone walk out at all? Because of what the wood was worth when it arrived. Dynamite was standard equipment, and it was used on jams judged too large, too tight, or too dangerous to work by hand, and sometimes as a first resort rather than a last one. But blasting is imprecise, and imprecision has a price. A saw log is only worth what a mill can cut out of it. Timber that has been shattered, split, or driven full of splinters is timber the mill discounts or refuses. The documented pattern is straightforward. On sawlog drives, explosives were used sparingly and reluctantly, and crews went out on foot when they judged it possible. On pulpwood, wood destined to be ground or chipped into pulp, the calculation reversed, because damage to a 4-foot bolt bound for a grinder costs nobody anything. That is the whole economic architecture of the trade in one sentence. The river drive existed because floating wood downhill on water the snow had already provided was the cheapest way to move timber ever devised, in country where a railroad grade cost a fortune per mile. And the man on the jam existed because the cheapest way to protect the cargo was a trained human being making a judgment call. So what did a full season of that actually look like? On the Clearwater, drives typically started around the 10th of May and ran roughly 21 days over about 90 miles, from the decks on the upper North Fork to the mill pond at Lewiston. That is 3 weeks of continuous work, and the crew structure reflected it. The jam crew worked ahead. The main body of drivers moved with the wood. Behind everything came the rear crew, also called the sacking crew, whose job was to walk the banks and the shallows recovering every log the river had stranded, which was thankless, endless, and the difference between a profitable drive and a mediocre one. Over all of it was the walking boss. They were fed and housed by the Wanigan, a floating cookhouse and bunkhouse built on a raft that moved downstream with the drive. Accounts describe 4 meals a day for men working in cold water, and the reason is nutritional rather than generous. Wages are documented unevenly. One Wisconsin county record for the late 19th century gives about $2.50 a day for experienced drivers, against $1.75 for green men. Comparable Idaho and Maine figures for the 20th century are not consistently recorded, and it would be dishonest to state one. Here is the thing worth noticing about all of it. Everyone on that river could see the jam crew working. The mill, the company, the season, and every other man's pay were visibly resting on a judgment 3 or 4 men were making in public, on their feet, in front of the people it affected. Very few trades concentrate their risk that visibly. And then the arithmetic changed. It changed first through the wood itself. Through the middle of the 20th century, American river drives shifted steadily from long sawlogs toward 4-foot pulpwood cut for paper mills. In Maine, that transition defined the last decades of driving on the Kennebec and the Penobscot. Bolts of spruce and fir sluiced through dam gates, held behind chained booms, walked along plank walkways by men with pick poles, and delivered to mills at Winslow and elsewhere. Pulpwood changed what the jam crew was for. When the cargo can be damaged without loss, the case for putting men out on a locked mass of timber weakens every year. Explosives became routine where they had been exceptional. Mechanical help arrived, power boats, then jet boats capable of working directly against the face of a jam, and pontoon-hulled wannagons that could take a riffle without breaking up. The men were still there. Men were on the Kennebec until 1976, and on the Clearwater until 1971, doing recognizable versions of the same work. But each piece of equipment closed part of the gap that the judgment had been filling. What finally closed the rest of it was not on the river at all. Where did it end first, and what ended it? It ended first in Idaho, and it was ended by concrete. Potlatch forests had driven the North Fork of the Clearwater since 1928, running nearly every spring except during the war, supplying roughly a third of the annual log intake at the Lewiston Mill, at the time the largest white pine mill in the world. The 1971 drive brought about 51 million board feet of timber down some 95 miles of river. It was a normal drive in every respect except that everyone on it knew it was the last one. Dworshak Dam had been under construction on the North Fork since 1966. During the final drive, the logs went through the dam's diversion tunnel. The boats and the wannagan were pulled out, trucked around the structure, and put back in below it. The tunnel was scheduled to be plugged permanently. When it was, the route simply ceased to exist. The 1971 Clearwater Drive is documented as the last major whitewater sawlog drive in the United States. The men who ran it had watched the work change under them for 20 years. Charles McAllister, the drive boss, had been on that river since 1950, and they had seen jet boats and radios make it measurably safer without making the judgment unnecessary. But Maine was still driving. What ended it there? 3 things at once, and none of them was a failure of the method. The first was law and public opinion. Bark shed by decades of floating timber had measurably degraded Maine's rivers, and after the Clean Water Act of 1972, the public appetite for using a river as a conveyor belt was gone. Legislation ended the practice. The second was roads. The Golden Road, 97 miles from Millinocket toward Moosehead Lake, was completed in 1972. Once a private haul road existed, trucks could deliver wood dry, sorted, on a schedule, in any season. The third was the mills themselves, rebuilt to receive wood by truck rather than by water. The last drive ran in 1976, Scott Paper's Wood, from the Moosehead Lake region down the Kennebec toward Winslow. Sources differ on the exact close. Some place the final Kennebec Log Driving Company drive in the summer, others as late as the 15th of November. Both dates appear in reputable accounts, and note the 2 competing claims honestly. Idaho's 1971 drive was the last major sawlog drive, Maine's 1976 drive the last log drive in North America. They are not in conflict. They are 2 different categories of the same ending. If this channel is going to keep documenting what it actually took to log an American forest by hand and by steam, subscribe. There are more falling crews, more spar trees, more steam donkeys, more logging railroads, and more river drives that quietly built the houses, the towns, and the railroads of a growing country, and were never described as historically significant at the time because the men doing the work didn't have time to think of it that way. What that judgment gave a drive, in the end, was cargo. Timber that reached the mill whole, because somebody could tell which log was carrying the load. And if you have a connection, a relative who worked as a faller, a high climber, a donkey engineer, a riverman, a log truck driver, put it in the comments. If someone in your family drove logs, do you know which river he worked and which crew? Still to come on this channel, the Wanigan, and what it took to feed men working 3 weeks in cold water. The Jam Crew man's work, in its original form, ended on the Clearwater in 1971 and on the Kennebec in 1976. By 1980, gravel haul roads and log trucks had changed how the work was done. What the trucks and the roads gave the trade. Wood delivered on a schedule instead of on a freshet, delivered dry, sorted, and unbruised, with no timber lost in the shallows, and no man standing on a mass of locked timber in April. What they did not give anyone, the ability to look at a mile of stopped wood and know which piece was carrying it. He did not know that was what the seasons had built in him. He knew it the first spring the wood went past his town on a truck. The river had known what to ask of him. No one had thought to tell the road to ask.